Hello, welcome everyone to today's webinar, Enhancing Cyber Resilience, the Critical Role of Risk Assessments. I'm Kara. I'm glad you're here. We all know that cyber threats aren't going anywhere, so knowing where your vulnerabilities lie is more important today than it ever has been. Today, we are joined by Roger Hill, CEO here at Hillstrong Group Security, and Dan Crane, Senior Cybersecurity Consulting Manager at Jacobs. Remember, this is a live event and we will do a Q&A at the end. So put your questions as we go in the chat and we'll get to those at the end. Thanks again for being here. We hope you enjoy. Roger, I'll turn it over to you.
Hey, thanks, Kara. Appreciate it. Well, welcome everyone. I have to admit, I've been looking forward to this one, Dan. I love talking about risk assessments. I tend to geek out, so I'm going to try to refrain from that today. But listen, Dan, let's start with introductions. Why don't you introduce yourself to the audience for those that might not know you?
Absolutely. Thanks, Roger. So I am Dan Crane. I lead the cybersecurity consulting portfolio here at Jacobs in critical infrastructure and OT security.
Awesome. So Jacobs, what industry sectors are you predominantly focusing on today, would you say?
Great question, Roger. So water is our happy home, as I like to call it. There is lots and lots of work that Jacobs involved in water. Energy and power is a very growing market for us as well. Mm-hmm. I come, as you well know, as we've met many times over the years, advanced manufacturing is something that's near and dear to my own heart. And then data centers specifically is a high growth area for my group in particular.
Oh yeah, that's an exploding area right now, especially when you consider some of the AI data centers and the cyber physical systems that are supporting those data centers that people don't necessarily think about.
Absolutely.
Dan, maybe as a way to start this discussion around risk assessments for OT is maybe start talking about what are some of the key differences between, an OT risk assessment, whether it's for critical infrastructure or other industrial control systems. How is that fundamentally different from some of the enterprise risk assessments? The first thing that pops in my head is the purpose, right? The purpose is operational, not informational as much, right? I think in OT, the question isn't, what data could be stolen. It's what process could be disrupted, degraded, or rendered unsafe. That's the key things. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. Life safety is number one. One thing that'll stick with me for the entirety of my career is doing a cybersecurity software installation for a very high risk chemical process in the EU. And the first tier of danger was estimated to hurt about 10 people on site. And then the second of 10 danger tiers was about 1,500 people dying in the local area to it. So process and life safety, very, very important. And I'll throw one out to anybody that has worked with this company before. But those operational risks, right? If it doesn't affect make, pack, ship for the particular company that uses that terminology, it doesn't really matter in the OT environment. We'll deal with certain amounts of data loss, but it's all about making sure we hit those business driving factors, whether it's production of widgets, power, water.
Yeah, sure. So maybe what we can do is, I'm sure we have a mixed audience. We typically do. So maybe for the benefit of the audience, let's frame risk assessments versus the multitude of different assessments out there. So I can go ahead and set the stage. So for example, when we're thinking about some of the different standards and frameworks, there's maturity assessments, such as with the NIST CSF, using the, cyber maturity model integration, the CMMI. Or there's what came out of the Department of Energy with the C2M2. So I really like maturity assessments for a certain type of function, right? But then there's the importance of gap assessments. and then there's risk assessments, and then there's a whole bunch of subcategories under risk assessments. How do you frame when to use risk assessments and what type of risk assessments you're using for certain scenarios?
Yeah, that's there is so much in that question, Roger.
Right?
The core of our business is a lot of maturity based assessments. Particularly a lot of requests under CSF, the 2.0 framework.
Mhm.
One thing we have done to set that aside is on a different DOE side is in working with INL is their consequence driven cyber informed engineering methodology. My team, we've done some of the trainings with them, we've worked with them, and that is actually something we use for risk because, we get the right stakeholders in the room and the right operational people and the right process people, and we say, hey, what are your high consequence events, right? To use the term, but what are the critical things you need to do, and let's identify what would make that stop happening, right? What are life safety events? What are massive impacts to your business? What are the things in this operational environment? So the risks are that, and also for mature programs. I tend to lean more towards risk assessments for mature programs who are ready to start having that conversation, because then you're all about taking these vulnerabilities and everything that's been identified and trying to, whether you're using FAIR or other models, trying to assign some kind of a guesstimate to a dollar value so that they can get, executive buy-in to say, hey, this is an investment we need to make.
So I really like that. And I like that you brought up the consequence-driven model out of INL. I think that's some great work. And I think that gets away from something that I've never really liked, which is just the likelihood-driven type of risk assessment methodologies. One thing that I wanted to mention, depending upon the sector that we're talking about, Dan. So, for example, some of manufacturing might be earlier in their journey in terms of OT security versus some other sectors. But the one thing I would maybe throw out, and I'd like to get your insights on this, is whenever we're looking at some type of a risk assessment engagement for an organization, what I really like to start with is do they have a defined OT security program? And, for example, do they have a charter? Have they actually formally defined their risk methodology? Because that's actually really crucial, because that's how you can actually have repeatable decision framework, if you will, in how you're going to evaluate risk for the organization. Because if you don't have that, that's really where you should start. Because no matter who's coming in to do some type of a risk assessment, there has to be that common framework. Let me pause there and get your thoughts.
Oh, yeah, you're practically giving our sales pitch for me. With my team, we have a lot of discussions around this. So we are not the most interesting people at parties. You definitely want to make sure it's open bar before you come talk to us about these topics. That helps smooth things over. I'm starting to look at the consultant mindset and what happens in the industry and what actually works for our clients, right? Works for the guys with the boots on the ground is this transformative kind of consulting, right? Like baking risk in, getting people to understand that whole process of you've got to have a good charter. That's something I'm literally working on this week, is writing a charter for one of our clients, so that they can build a program. They just hired an OT security manager last month. So it's time for them to make the investment. It's a kind of a fun journey to work through there.
Yeah.
So,
So we've kind of talked a little bit about the what.
Yeah.
Let's maybe talk about the when, and I'll kind of give some of my thoughts, right? So I framed it up earlier about the differences between the different types of assessments. When I start working with an organization that is, let's say, earlier in their OT security journey or midway, I really like to look at scaling programs. And first of all, what do I even mean by program? right? So when I'm talking about the OT security program, it's really building out your entire security program that's built on people, process, and technology. It's not just about having some sensors out there that are detecting, because great, you're detecting, but what are you going to do after you detect, right? You have to have a plan. So part of that that model for building out that organization is having the right processes in place, the right policies that are specific to the OT security program, but also that integrates into the larger enterprise risk framework, right? That the enterprise might be using. Because ultimately, somebody is going to have to report out on that risk and the state of the business. So what I like to do, and I promise I'm getting to a point, what I like to do for organizations is I am a fan of maturity-based assessments at the organizational level, because that is a really good mechanism or a vehicle, if you will, for determining what is your current state across different categories versus your desired state. And it really lends itself really well to producing that roadmap of where you want to be in terms of an initial operating capability or IOC and a future operating capability. Now, having said that, the reason I like that maturity-based model is because it's really about maturing that organization and changing behavior, right? It's not necessarily the same thing as a risk assessment. They're overlapping. So when I look at a risk assessment, one of the things how I would answer the when is a baseline. So for example, let's take a global manufacturer. If I'm looking at a manufacturer that has 100, 200 sites globally, right? They have a bigger challenge. I guarantee you a good percentage of those sites came through acquisition, right? And different, you know the drill. They have different architectures, different vendors. It's a hodgepodge. So how do you define what are the different tiers of risk across your fleet of sites? Now, what's important there is to establish a baseline. That baseline activity, this is an ideal scenario for that risk assessment to establish that baseline for each tier. That's my personal Montour methodology. I'd love to get your thoughts.
Absolutely. I really like to do a maturity-based assessment kind of first thing in the door. Let's find out where we are, set that baseline. Here's the systems. Maybe we've got some vulnerabilities. We've got some raw data. Maybe there's a roadmap to resolving those. And then that question is, right. And again, to me, risk is a little bit more mature. We've at least thought about some things. So risk appetite. What is acceptable to you? What is not acceptable to you? Global manufacturing, how much line outage, right? How much lost raw material, how much, lost time. A very cool example I've seen worked in the power industry, not to change industries on us, but I think this is really illustrative of the point. Loss of credit card data in PCI. So how much does it cost to lose one credit card? How much does it cost to lose 100,000 credit cards? How much does it cost to lose 1 million credit cards? And so there was a team that we were part of, and we said, okay, well, here's the cost. Here's how this cost grows, and eventually it kind of plateaus out, right? You're just buying credit monitoring for everybody. So they said, this is not an acceptable risk for us. We do not want to set aside this amount of millions of dollars. So they went in and made that decision. Okay, we don't have the appetite for this. We're going to mitigate these and then ensure the things that we aren't. So we're going to get it down to the point where we're okay with that level of risk. So to me, the when is when people are ready to have that discussion about what, taking a very hard look at what's good and what's not good. And while we're saying, it's operational, it's ready to translate that OT and that ops and that vulnerability and that rigmarole of cybersecurity to, director, executive level operational. Here's the risks to the organization, same that you would see with, changing vendors or any supply chain management or other programs.
So that's actually insightful. What are some of the different standards and frameworks that you guys are using today on the risk assessment side of the house? And what what are your personal thoughts on what are some of the tools available for the
Yeah.
OT folks out there?
Yeah. So we started using the NIST risk management framework, much like a lot, a lot of teams did, and we still do offer, services engagements around that. But um, I'll be honest, my team staged a little bit of a mutiny, so we almost exclusively use our own take on that CCE methodology to do those risk assessments. It's all about driving to the actionable outcomes. So if you want a broad scale, we can do RMF. We can even start looking at FAIR and other models there. But ideally, and what we're seeing our customers engage with, and where the team and the output really shines to action is kind of flipping that CCE methodology from, okay, we're going to, we want to engineer out risks, and we want to and not have to do administrative controls, right? Very similar to PPE and health safety concerns. But we're using those to identify the biggest risks to the organization. So maybe you start small, we identify 4, and then that gives you kind of a footprint and exercise you can run through to go deeper and deeper and deeper and identify more as you go down.
So do you find the CCE is being adopted in certain industry sectors faster than other sectors? What are you guys seeing?
I am. Oil and natural gas are very, very large fans of it.
Sure.
Obviously, energy as well. I'm starting to see, particularly, strangely enough, while I love all of my water clients, wastewater. I think because they tend to be larger systems, more district-based versus more city-based. Which is a very broad generalization. Anybody raising their hand going, that's not true for me, I know. But I think the wastewater folks, the larger wastewater systems are starting to look at this as well. They're seeing some of the benefits to running through these exercises. I would love to see this in manufacturing. I haven't seen it much lately, but especially with the speed of these large global manufacturers, right, where we're constantly updating lines and we're putting new lines in. Embedding that into not only from a cybersecurity and safety design, but also identifying those risks in the beginning when we're doing these upgrades would be really, really cool. So I'm not seeing it in advanced manufacturing, but I'm going to be the guy waving the flag at CS4CA saying this is where we should do it.
Yeah, at the end of the day, the camp I land in is what's best for that organization. Right. And it really goes back to your risk methodology. I think there's a lot of merits. So like I said, I'm a fan of the CCE, but I think when you at a broad spectrum, I think you can kind of look at RMF, NIST 830. But I think in a lot of the manufacturing sector and, some of the utilities, you can look at the IC 62443 3-2. And I think it's a very natural extension in process industry and some manufacturing to look at the cyber PHA. There's some folks here in the U.S. that have just done a really phenomenal job in driving that. Maybe just to talk about something we haven't talked about is what is your views of how the MITRE ICS attack matrix applies or does not apply in terms of risk assessments?
Oh, that is a really good question. That's another one, very, very constant resource. It's number 2 on my bookmarks list, if anybody wanted to know. While I may have a good chunk of 853 memorized, I can't memorize the whole map for the attack framework or embed as well. Definitely got my eye on that for the OT environments. So I like to do this on the bigger engagements where we've got time and effort from people. Is when we've identified these risks and maybe we've got some vulnerability ideas. I like to do that mapping. Right. So, okay, here's the risk. Here's the kind of techniques that, I build it backwards. Right. I'm kind of building the boat from the top down rather than the bottom up, which gives us a really unique take on it. So we've identified, this particular kind of risk is Maybe we don't have good secure remote access. One global manufacturer in particular that we've talked about did not have that, or maybe the best segmentation, right? So there's some inherent risk here in that there's a lot of data crossing boundaries between different sites. So what are the techniques that take advantage of it? Right? What are these attack paths? So I like to use MITRE in general, like as an attack surface mapping, and giving people, it's guesswork a little bit at this point. Obviously pretty informed guesswork based on having the conversations and having done the assessment. Without fear mongering, though, giving somebody an idea of this is how this can happen. And these are not your actions, but these are those adversarial actions based on, maybe you've got more activists, particularly now. I would be a little concerned if I had Unitronics HMIs, given current events. That's where we like to use it. Is I kind of use it backwards. So rather than pen testing vulnerability mapping, I'm doing it the other side to saying, okay, here's these identified risks. How do we get back to that maturity level?
No, I think that makes sense. I always fall back to doing things at scale, and that doesn't necessarily mean just manufacturing. As an example, when we're looking at scaling out programs, that could be a fleet of commercial buildings in the building control system space. It can be water utilities for a large operator and management organization for water utilities. I think there's a lot of merit of establishing that baseline to go back to the when, right? So whether we're just looking at some of the wells and pump stations and creating that baseline, because that's one advantage that a lot of the water space has, is a lot of cookie cutter systems in terms of the pump stations and everything else. It's highly mappable, if you will.
Yes.
One of the things I wanted to address, so we kind of established it's great as a baseline when you just get started, but going back outside of the utility space to more on the commercial side. And one of the things that's really something that's not really considered as much is the M&A activity, or the mergers and acquisitions. So if you're part of a larger organization and you're in the middle of maybe due diligence, that's a really great time to say, hey, listen, we need to do some type of a risk assessment on this organization as we're looking to acquire. I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations with organizations of, we just acquired this and I don't know what we acquired, right? And what that risk is. I think that's another great example. Major CapEx projects. That's another great time to actually do a risk assessment, to actually have that that baseline. Maybe a large digitalization initiative. Those are times that are acting as trigger events for risk assessments. What are some others that might pop out at you, Dan?
Yeah. I really like that. So transient events is really what we're talking about, right? So we have our baseline, and we would both love to see this happen maybe annually, which very, very, very wishful thinking, right? So I would love to see the maturity and risk going back and forth on a continual basis. But any of those transient events, so whether it's also if you have, maybe your company has to do a large layoff, or maybe you're doing leverage buyouts. And so all of your OT staff that built up your systems over the past 20, 30 years said, hey, I'm going to go ahead and retire. You're welcome to call me back at $400 an hour. There's new elements of risk that are getting introduced into the environment. So I'm going to lean directly into that process control terminology. So any of those kinds of transient events should be triggers for maybe a mini risk assessment. But major changes to the state or the way the business operates, whether it's merger, acquisition, divestiture, layoffs, maybe, again, a bit sort of current events. If you have a very, 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 very mobile workforce as like a global consultant, and you're seeing what's going on in the air industry right now, is there elevated risk for you? And I mean, this is very different from cybersecurity, but those kinds of things. Better example, more close to what we do, would be, going back 4 years now, to SolarWinds incident, right? So
It's hard to believe it's been that long.
yeah.
Yeah, it seems like it's yesterday, but yeah.
So
let me, there's something that I feel like we almost have to address with, the hype curve of AI.
Yeah.
You brought up a really good point. Almost every standard and framework I know recommends at least an annualized risk assessment. Everyone I know in the community agrees, including myself. And then as soon as we get done agreeing, we'll also agree that it's not feasible. So, it's the recommendation, but it's not really operationally feasible. Having said that, what are the advantages or the disadvantages that AI and different types of AI bring to our world, right?
Yeah.
I think we have to address the elephant in the room. Right?
Yes. It even in our sound check, right, Roger? The brief conversation about AI at the recent conference. So there is so much that can be done here, and I'll give my very, very, very short soapbox on AI. Is the best use case is digging through and sifting data and putting it in front of humans' eyes to make decisions. To me, that is the advantage now. As it continues to evolve, right? We're going from generative AI, and people are saying, and we're talking about agentic AI, and I've got a whole different soapbox about that. I won't take us down. But to me, the advantage is with the digitally connected world, and with the amount of information that's available in modern systems and modern control systems, particularly in something like manufacturing that you may not see in water and some of the some of the utility-based industries. Maybe there's a lot of MQTT, there's a whole bunch of tags, they're maybe doing data lakes. There's so much more information, there's so many more logs and set points and things. It's not feasible to pay a large group of people to go through this all the time. So being able to build a model that does some form of behavioral analytics, right? The initial AI ML curve that everybody was on, but also to get to that annual kind of basis that we would like to see is, I'll get to the dangers in a second here. I'm not putting those to the side, but something that can start to pull those out. And we're seeing that, right? We're kind of, a lot of people in the industry are playing with this, saying, okay, if I bring in all of the, all the domain policy, we're going to run an LLM through this, and we're going to say, hey, you match this, and you don't match that, which is obviously more maturity based and maybe CIS control based. But that speeds up the time, right? You need fewer people to do it. You need a whole lot less time to do it. So other advantage is it can be cost effective, with the asterisk of be careful what, how big a system you're deploying in AWS or Azure and the GPUs that you're assigning to it. The disadvantage is kind of exactly the opposite of that. I'll say model collapse and kind of leave it there, right? If you're training the data set and you have and you're running everything internally, maybe that feedback loop is bad, and so maybe you're steering your model off the wrong course, and so you're getting bad information there. Outside of actual, inner workings of the LLM issues, I worry about the loss of critical thinking skills. The very, very human problem that comes in there, Roger. So
it's an interesting article I just came across this morning. It's ironic that you brought that up. Anyway, please continue your thought, and I'll bring that up.
So I think so training of the model is a disadvantage also, right? It's so emergent. Having the skills and making sure that the general AI systems that are out there, right, chat, whether we're talking Llama or DeepSeek, depending on your level of risk appetite, or Grok or OpenAI, are you doing an enterprise-based model? Is there a risk to the data that you're putting into that model? Whether that's to external disclosure or internal disclosure, right? Do we want our CFO's annual reports being able to be read by an intern or a temp worker? So there's, I guess I'll say data security, model deviation, and then loss of skills via overdependence for the disadvantages and risks I see.
You covered a lot.
Yes.
So yes, I think it's really interesting. If we take a step back and just think about that 30,000-foot view, what is the major benefit of AI? Just as a very generally speaking, to me, it's just really about being a force multiplier. It's about driving efficiency. Having said that, hallucinations are so very real. There's no replacement for human oversight, and the human oversight is actually critical, and sometimes it is skipped, and that's really a danger. So when I think about some of the advantages and different use cases of AI within OT security, summarizing information very quickly, sure, that makes sense. But what really concerns me is I can't think of hardly any information that exists below that industrial DMZ that we don't deem as critical or proprietary, right? So that really begs the question of, okay, if we're talking about LLMs, now are we talking about a closed model that was trained on our DeepSeek or something that's closed, or are we sending it public? And then that's just a really scary thing. And then we have to think about, okay, now what are the controls that are additional controls that weren't part of our OT security system? So for example, if we're allowing some of this interaction, what inspection is taking place? That's essentially identifying any of the proprietary information that's heading outbound, right? And scrubbing that. So I think there's some additional technical controls that we have to think about, not to mention, of course, the administrative that really falls more into the data privacy, which is really ironic because data privacy is typically something or historically something that we haven't really concerned ourselves with on the OT side, because it's more about cyber physical being the key word, physical systems, right? But no, data privacy comes into play now, and it's actually very relevant. Now, I think I like the way you started to break it down into the different, let's talk about the different sub-buckets of AI, because everyone throws AI into this big, broad bucket, big, broad category. And there's so many different agentic RAG, the augmented retrieval. I think that's actually something worth maybe mentioning, because I think when you think about taking the standards, so whether we're talking about as an organization, we have our own program, our own governance program, or whether we are fully aligned with IEC 62443 3-3, or whatever that is, right? That being the key word, that is an interesting way to look at using agentic RAG to have a set guidelines that we're going to measure against, right? In terms of whether it's policies, procedures. I think there's different use cases there where we can actually limit those hallucinations. But let me kind of get your thoughts, because I know you kind of skimmed over the agentic RAG, but I think it might be worth mentioning.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting thought with the 62443. Right. Well, the first thing that always comes to mind there is zones and conduits. So that would be a really interesting exercise if we're looking at implementing something like that, is, okay, do we have different buckets of data that different people can see. Can we separate that out in the model or the front end of the model that we're using to write it? That immediately, I'm literally thinking through this live here.
Right? No,
That
that's
immediately,
what I love.
yeah, immediately goes, I wonder about role-based access control, in those features. So as you were talking, just a funny thought that occurred to me that might be one to share is, is the AI chatbot on somebody's website the new? I'll make reference to the XKCD Bobby tables. The SQL injection is the agentic AI, or probably agentic, maybe not generative, but are these big integrated AIs that run entire systems? Is that the new form of data leak instead of SQL injection? To gain access to something that's a thought, and I'm sure people know significantly more than I won't profess to be an expert on any of the inner workings there. I have my hands full just talking about risk.
Yeah. I definitely fall in that camp, Dan, and I think it goes back to that baseline concept. So if you're a water utility, right, and maybe you're looking at the freshwater side, and you want to kind of create that baseline, or you're on the wastewater side and you want to create that baseline. I think it's really important to have either an outside firm or your in-house team utilizing your own risk methodology, but do that baseline of whatever that best framework is for your organization, right? But have that baseline to work from. Once you have that baseline, it's actually really interesting to think about some of the different forms of AI where it actually can benefit, as long as you do it in a safe manner, right? So one of the things that I like to think about, Dan, is really, can we look at like maybe more of a weighted risk index on a more continuous basis? Once we have that baseline where we're factoring in weighted scoring on asset criticality, right? Now that shouldn't change much, right? But it has that weighted impact score. That way we can isolate. So whether it's manufacturing, we're looking at one machine skid, or it's a water and we're looking at a certain pump station, whatever, clarifier, whatever the case may be, we're looking at things such as exploitability, right? Which I like so much better than likelihood, but and then visibility of the network, right? And I think this is where we can separate the vulnerability from the exploitability, right? And not just using the CVSS score, because it's understanding how is that component actually installed on our system? What other controls do we have in place?
Absolutely.
I think this is an opportunity where once we have that baseline, we can leverage technology to give us more of an interesting, continuous risk feedback. Something Monte Carlo and Bayesian. I think there's some really interesting scenarios there. I must have hit something there, Brett. What do you have a thought there?
Man, yes, that is the brass ring I'm chasing. Whether it's something that happens in house or I think the first team to crack the code here is in for a wild ride, and be prepared to talk to a lot of VC firms. Absolutely. The continuous data collection, right, is something we want as part to evaluate our risks. I very much, and I've played with this myself, is doing Monte Carlo simulations and doing Bayesian probability. I right now I'm literally just doing the math in a little container because I'm not great at programming in R. And I'll accept suggestions if there's an easier way to do it, but my beard is gray enough. I like to do things the hard way. I've absolutely played around with that. I want to figure out a better way to measure risk, right? Ideally, whether it's AI or whether it's anything else, can we move the assumptions as far to the right as possible? Rather than, if you look at a lot of the risk models now, and IAC is probably the best of them, but if you look at a lot of the other, especially on the enterprise side, all the assumptions happen over here. And everybody talks about, and if you look at what actuarial papers are talking about for cybersecurity risk, they're like, well, we don't have enough data about the systems. Well, there's ways to get the data. I've personally worked for companies that specialize in getting that kind of operational data or cybersecurity operational data out of systems. So how do we model that? I would love to see that in my latest thought, right? I'll throw an even crazier one out there, is once we get this kind of model built up and we use ML to assist us with this. Monte Carlo simulations are great, but is there also like perturbation theory? Right, I'm going to steal from physics and say, if we start randomly, changing some of the weights here and there, is there something we can tease out of this to say, hey, these are the systems for getting CVSS, maybe EPSS as an addendum, as a starting place, right? What's the probability on that and pulling out those informations? So, and also bringing in those other factors too. We've got a really cool, and I'm generally not trying to make this a sales pitch, but it works. We've got a really cool system that we put in place for one of our clients that they have these very long, over a quarter-mile long, basically stilling basins that at the end of their process before things go out to the river. And when the wind kicks up, the chlorine demand goes up in the system. So one of the things my data science team did, again, right, not a huge sales pitch, but one of the things the data science team did is, okay, they baseline the system, right? They did the heuristics, and I think it might be, again, well, I can ask them. I think there's a little bit of Bayesian modeling going on in there. And then they take the weather forecast and bring that data in, and it goes into this, and they say, hey, 12 hours from now, this is what your chlorine demand is going to be based on that. How do we flip that to the cybersecurity side?
I can see that measuring that new input data, producing different probabilities.
Yeah, exactly.
Outcomes. Yeah, that's interesting. So, hey, listen, Dan, there's something I've got to address because it's just something that I've just been focusing on here for a while now, and that's the integrated indirect, right? So, what I mean by that is I think our community, it's so interesting to see how our community of this OT, ICS, IECS, cybersecurity has really grown in this, from post Stuxnet on. Grown in terms of the attention that it's garnered, how the community has grown in terms of the number of people. But I think also in terms of there's a lot of great contribution of different methodologies and approaches. We've talked about some of these today: CCE, ICS Minder, Attack Framework. The part that does concern me, though, is in our community, and you've probably seen this yourself, when you go into it at a site level and you're doing an assessment, what the lens is typically from that industrial DMZ south, right? Anything north of that industrial DMZ is ignored. Or if it's taken into account, it's the ones and zeros crossing into the industrial DMZ, right? The thing that really concerns me is this, and I call it the convergence of risk. And there's the building control system side of the house, which is the shell of the infrastructures where our sites are, where corporate is. It's all the lighting control systems, the HVAC, and all these other systems that are probably running on the building control systems that they're not necessarily a target, but a threat vector. Could be a weakest link, right? Is there a way for an adversary to pivot? Get to a point, I promise. The other side of it is really on the IT side, where they're kind of looking at the carpeted side of the house. And of course, we established we're looking at the DMZ. When we look at ransomware, right? I take the last 12 months and look at every case of ransomware, and I think you'll find north of 70% of the impacts, and let's define impacts as production was shut down. it was shut down because of that ransomware attack. 70% never touched that industrial DMZ or south. Now, it's the indirect systems. We can even go back to the Colonial Pipeline and the billing systems. I would argue, I don't care that it didn't touch the industrial control system network, the process control network, or even the industrial DMZ. If the impact is the same, it disrupted my mission. It's about the mission. So that's the part that I feel like is really not being addressed today, is the convergence of the integration. And it's not just the ones and zeros. It's where the ones and zeros aren't there, right? Whether it's a billing system, predictive and preventive maintenance systems, but that typically has some type of ones and zeros. But anyway, I want to get your thoughts, because that's an area that I think really needs to be highlighted.
Absolutely. And this is one, if nothing, I mean, I read a lot of what you post, but this is the one that always I find the most thought-provoking for me. One small example of where it is done a little right is if you look at American Water Works Association, they're kind of mid-tier maturity for risk and resilience assessments for water. They do get into just a little bit, right, about HIPAA and PCI, even though it's meant for SCADA or DCS, or even PLC based, depends on if you got a guy filling up a 50-gallon bucket in his backyard and he's considered a water system. But AWWA kind of looks at that. It's such a challenging conversation. You've seen as much as I have, is IT doesn't trust OT. And I will grossly overcharacterize this, right? That sometimes your enterprise professionals are looking at OT as the extremely blue collar. I'll even go so far as to say, right, knuckle draggers. They don't know what they're talking about. They don't know anything about security. They don't know anything about this advanced persistent threat, but they do know how their systems operate, and they are. So there's a translation issue, I think, that happens between this integration and this hyper focus. And not that you've meant to, but even called me out on. I mean, it very indirectly called me out on it, right? I'm thinking, okay, ICS firewall down. It's very, very common for me with my teams to say, okay, if we see something, say something. But we're so hyper focused, and does there need to be an OT CISO kind of role for the large kind of organizations, right? For oil and gas or advanced manufacturing, where funding makes sense, whereas utilities may not have it. I'd love to see an overall cultural shift of the partnership where OT can trust IT systems in general. And I see this across every industry I've worked in, where there's OT. Can the OT people trust the IT people to not put in policies that cause production stops? And can IT trust OT to also follow good practice, right? And not be picking up USB drives out of the parking lot, to use a poor example. Or my personal favorite is the HMI I saw at an energy plant, a panel view HMI that was running a thin client. World of Warcraft was on it. So a guy was doing plant tours and leveling a World of Warcraft character. So those breach of trust issues, I think, is the problem we need to solve.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting point. As you're talking about ITOT, I know this is probably deviating a little bit from our topic, but I want to throw it out there. One of the most important things that I think I personally in our organization does, and this isn't unique to us. I think any organization can and should be doing this, is at the end of an assessment, regardless of what that assessment is. Typically, you are looking at what are your deliverables. Your deliverables are more than likely some type of a report of this is where you are, this is where you should be, right? And then ultimately, you have some type of a strategic security roadmap, something that is mapping out what you should do to close those gaps, no matter what type of assessment was done, right? If you're early in your organization one of the most important things that you can do is the very first step is to, number one, create your charter, because that charter is like the founding fathers document. It provides that authority to operate to the rest of the organization. Because what is OT security? It is a security discipline that is really cross-domain. And that means you have many different silos that you're operating in with different reporting structures. So having that authority to operate and evidence where people feel freely ready to contribute, that's number one. Number two, establish that advisory board or steering committee that is the cross-domain discipline of IT and OT. It takes a village. That is the most important thing to establish, because to your point, what that does is that brings that organization together. That's the one thing I think I've been very, very effective at, is bridging both those worlds, because I can talk to both worlds, really, having lived in it, right? But I think it's really key, because here's what I've seen is we have to break down the silos. After spending 30 years in this space, it's about breaking down this. It's about the mission. The mission is a unified mission. It needs to be. And break down those silos, because at the end of the day, I think we're approaching some of the things wrong. And what are things, right? Let's think about an MSSP for OT security, or some of the detection technologies. If we are only having sensor capabilities south of that DMZ or at the industrial DMZ, wow, that's kind of really, really late notification to be able to act. What we really need is early warning sensors, because 99% of the threats are coming from that connectivity of IT to OT. The other 1% are at the edge. It's thinking about the solution partners, the integrators, the army of other contractors that are coming into our facility, and it's the edge of that facility. So anyway, sorry, Al, sucking up some oxygen here, Dan. Let me turn it over to you and get your thoughts.
Yeah. A short one here actually is the charter is good. One thing I've been implementing is I've been forcing everybody involved to do an after action review with me and lead, almost agile style. So before anything else, we've published out the report. You've read the report, but what went well, what didn't go well? What are the highlights? So let's have that conversation with everybody in the same room. Okay, this is all in the report, right? What's written is written, but let's actually talk about why. When I was walking around your plant floor, I saw operator credentials sticky noted to the monitor. There's a problem that needs to be solved here, and it's not a security problem. I mean, it is, but ultimately, we've got a people and process problem of why is it so hard that they need to do this? Is there a better way? Do you need to put in RFIDs? Can they badge? So I really like putting in these after action reviews where you open up the floor, right? It requires really good facilitation, but that's to me even my immediate step, and this is something I've written into all of my work streams.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's so important, whether it's after actions, retrospectives, or just continuous improvement. It's just absolutely crucial. Dan, I think we ought to maybe take a look at any questions we might have in the audience here. I think we have one here that maybe I might misinterpret this. It's while doing risk assessment, does company completed to give risk matrix? I'm going to have a little inference here that maybe what the question is asking is that during a risk assessment, is it common to give a risk matrix? I think for a risk assessment, in my opinion, yes. That's kind of a foundational element of a risk assessment to establish that. And again, what I would say further is it needs to be aligned with your risk methodology as an organization, right? And I think something else that I think Dan pointed out really well is another really important document is the risk appetite, because that's going to map into that risk matrix as well. Dan, what are your thoughts?
No, I agree. So that risk appetite almost is a mini charter in its own right, right? Or it's a mission statement, kind of like here's what's good, here's what's not good. Um, a good risk assessment is always going to at least start your risk matrix. If this is the first time you've ever done it, it's going to be an incomplete document, and everybody will know that. But yes, this is super critical, and again, extremely topical. I'm reviewing one that my team is putting together this week, so very near and dear to my heart.
There's a question slash statement, and I really like this actually. It's the outcome of determining the client's risk appetite will potentially depend upon who you are asking that question of within the client organization. First of all, I 100% agree, right? What I would say, though, is if it's a scenario where the risk appetite has already been established, that really should have been with that advisory board that has that cross domains, where you have the different stakeholders that are contributing to that risk appetite. Because yes, you will 100% have different perspectives, as you should have the different perspectives. I guess that's one of the first things I think about. If you're helping an organization create that risk appetite, maybe that's an interesting one to think about, Dan, of who are some of the stakeholders that we want to involve.
Yeah, that is. And, advisory board, I like to get a wide swath of it. In general, I like to threaten that I'm not scared to pull operators into the room for a risk appetite discussion. I wouldn't. But I want process control engineers. I want some of your enterprise architects in there, right? I want in those domains that we're talking about in the advisory board, if we can get some subject matter experts or technology champions to all sit together and have that discussion, right? Like let the executive oversight do what they do, but get this broad input. And it's hard to be more specific than that, because you could be talking about a Fortune 50 company, or you can be talking about water utilities with 50 employees, and those are going to be very different conversations.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. So the same person has another question here around the impact of a third-party vendors on any risk assessment solution. So that's really good. What I would say is that what I typically do here in terms of third party is I typically look at this from either a gap or maturity based assessment. I don't necessarily look at, or at least historically, haven't had the third party vendor assessment be in the same scope as a risk assessment of the control system. I'm not sure if you have seen things differently, but I do think that a third-party risk program specifically tuned for OT is absolutely crucial today, because it's how our world operates, and that's maybe something that the IT side of the house doesn't understand as much. So, for example, when we do have a scheduled downtime outage, right? That's where the parking lot is filled with cars, because we have an army of contractors showing up in that 1 week or 2 week window to do a 6 months worth of work within 2 weeks. And this is just how our world operates. It operates with integrators and solution partners and contractors, and that's a whole nother level of risk. And then there's the OEMs themselves, right? So yeah, it's so crucial in my opinion. Dan, what are your thoughts on the third party risk and nuances for OT?
Yeah. So point number one, that supply chain risk management is the number one most common recommendation that comes out of any of my assessment activities, particularly cybersecurity of supply chain risk management, right? The kind of new emerging field that goes there. Obviously, it's a different relationship with the different organizations you've just talked about. typically I'm seeing in risk assessment, we make that mention of, hey, you need to do something here. But there's enough nuance between, okay, I've got an OEM, all right, Emerson came in and put my DCS in, but I've got somebody local that supports it, that's Emerson certified. And then maybe we have some guys that came in from SEL and they're doing. So there's a lot of different moving parts and pieces on that third party one. So it almost deserves its own little mini assessment.
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, Dan, I think we're right at time here. Been an absolute pleasure. Great to talk to you again, and great to have a webinar with you. I think you've had some really interesting insights, and I think you've helped to give some real nuggets to the audience. I want to thank everyone for joining here today, and feel free to reach out to Dan or myself for any additional questions. And I think we have an interesting series coming up with some additional webinars with Jacob. So looking forward to that. So Dan, any closing thoughts on your side?
I'll keep it brief. Fantastic discussion as always, Roger. Always fun to chat. Thank you for having me. And very much on that, if there's any questions, comments, I may be a bit slow to respond. Unfortunately, I do have a bit of a day job, but I'm always happy to engage on this topic. It's it's something I love doing.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Dan, and I really appreciate everyone joining today. And until next time.
Thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate you sharing your time with us. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. If you had a question that we didn't get around to, please send me a message on LinkedIn and I will get an answer back to you. Thanks, Roger and Dan, for sharing your experiences and insights. And we do these webinars monthly, so be on the lookout for the next invite. For more information, please go to hillstrongsecurity.com and have a great day. See you next time.